Okay, let's dive into something we all think about, maybe obsess over sometimes.
Hmm.
What actually draws us to another person?
Hmm.
It feels a bit mysterious, doesn't it? Like, how do those connections form? Why that specific person?
It absolutely can feel mysterious.
Right.
But, thankfully, psychology has been, well, hard at work for decades trying to pull back the curtain on the underlying processes,
Right.
really trying to understand the how and why of attraction and relationships.
Exactly. And that's really what this deep dive is all about today. We're going to try and unpack the psychological research.
Uh-huh.
We've pulled from a stack of sources, key studies, some classic theories, just to see what the science has to say about, the factors drawing people together and how relationships actually develop over time.
Yeah, and our mission here is to really break down these concepts, to
Yeah.
understand the evidence, see where different ideas might align, and maybe more importantly, where they clash or get challenged by newer findings.
And specifically for you listening, if you're maybe navigating the world of social psychology or just starting to wrestle with these big ideas, this deep dive is kind of tailored to help you make sense of some core concepts.
Right.
To see how theories get built and tested and evaluated, it's not just about memorizing terms, it's more about understanding that messy, fascinating process of psychological discovery.
Think of it as getting maybe a clearer map of the psychological terrain when it comes to human connection.
Perfect. So if we're thinking about attraction,
Hmm.
where do you even begin?
Mm.
Is it the most obvious place, that first look? Physical attractiveness.
Mm.
Is beauty universal, or is it truly just in the eye of the beholder?
That question. It's launched 1,000 studies, hasn't it?
I bet.
And while there's certainly subjective taste involved, the research points to some, well, surprising consistencies.
All right.
Take the work by Cunningham and his colleagues back in 1995.
Okay, tell us about that one. What were they looking at?
Yeah. So they wanted to see if there were any specific facial features that were consistently rated as attractive, but across different cultures.
Right.
They showed photos of women's faces to men from various backgrounds, white, Hispanic, Asian participants.
And what did they find? Were there common themes? Any overlap?
Absolutely. They found remarkable agreement, actually. Certain features kept popping up as attractive across all these cultural groups.
Like, right.
Things like large eyes, high cheekbones, a relatively small nose, high eyebrows.
Okay, so these are features often associated with maybe
Yeah.
femininity, youthfulness.
Mm.
Are we talking about potential evolutionary cues here? Signaling health or fertility, perhaps?
That interpretation is often applied, yeah.
Yeah.
These findings do provide evidence suggesting there might be some underlying, perhaps evolutionary or deeply ingrained standards of beauty that kind of transcend specific cultural upbringing.
Okay, so that's one part, what features might be seen as attractive. But then there's this whole other layer, isn't there? The
Yeah.
assumption that if someone's physically attractive, they must be good in other ways too.
Ah, yes, the classic attractiveness stereotype, or the what is beautiful is good effect.
Right.
Wheeler and Kim explored this back in 1997, and what they found is particularly interesting because they looked at it across different cultures.
Different cultures. Like the Cunningham study you mentioned.
Yes, but they focused specifically on the stereotype itself. They compared American students representing a more individualistic culture, with Korean students representing a more collectivist culture.
And did this stereotype hold up in both places?
It did, pretty strongly, across both the American and Korean participants. Individuals rated as physically attractive were consistently also rated more positively on personality traits.
Like what kind of traits?
Oh, things like trustworthiness, friendliness, competence. Essentially, people just assumed attractive individuals had more positive characteristics.
Hmm.
And this was regardless of whether the culture was individualistic or collectivist.
Wow. So even if the specific ideal features have some universal thread, this tendency to just assume someone good-looking is also a good person. That seems to be a pretty universal human shortcut in judgment.
It seems so.
That's a big implication right there, and it shapes our entire initial perception of someone.
Exactly. It's just, this isn't just, say, a Western phenomenon. It's a pretty pervasive cognitive bias in how we perceive others.
Okay, so we've got these potential universal features and this pervasive stereotype.
Mm.
That makes it sound like physical attractiveness is this incredibly powerful, dominant force in attraction for absolutely everyone.
Hmm.
But that doesn't quite square with how relationships actually work for many people, does it? I mean, some people prioritize looks way less than others.
Absolutely not. You're right. And this is where individual differences become really, really important.
Okay.
The research shows that while these general tendencies might exist, how much they actually matter to you depends a lot on who you are.
Right.
And this brings us nicely to a study by Toway in 1979.
Ah, the MECU scale study. The title alone raises an eyebrow, doesn't it?
It does.
What was the setup there?
So TOEI had participants look at photographs, but also biographical sketches of individuals, and then rate how much they liked them. The crucial piece was that the participants also completed this scale called the MECU scale. It was designed back then to measure sort of traditional, somewhat rigid and, well, sexist attitudes towards women.
Okay, so they're trying to see if your attitudes about gender influence how much you actually care about physical appearance.
Precisely. And the key finding was pretty clear. Participants who scored higher on the MECU scale, meaning they held more of those sexist attitudes, they were significantly more influenced by the physical attractiveness of the person in the photo when deciding how much they liked them.
And for those with lower scores on that scale?
They placed significantly less emphasis on physical appearance. Their liking ratings were influenced more by the other stuff the biographical information provided, not just the picture.
That's fascinating. So it means the power of physical attraction isn't just about the face you're looking at. It's filtered through your own personality, your own belief system, your attitudes.
It really flips the script, doesn't it? From just looking at the target of attraction to looking at the perceiver.
Yeah.
The conclusion is really critical for understanding individual differences in attraction. The degree to which physical appearance matters is moderated by your own traits and attitudes. It's definitely not a universally dominant factor in the same way for every single person.
Okay, that connects things beautifully then.
Yeah.
We start with these possible universal tendencies in what is seen as attractive. We layer on a pervasive stereotype about what attractiveness means, but then we zoom out and see that how much any of that actually influences your liking for someone.
Well, that depends a lot on the psychological makeup of you, the individual doing the perceiving.
Exactly.
It's a much more complex picture than just they're hot.
Much more complex indeed. Okay, so we've talked about that initial spark, the role of looks, how stereotypes play a part, and how your own mindset influences it all. But obviously, relationships aren't built just on a first impression or that initial attraction.
Right.
How do we go from potentially being attracted to a whole bunch of people out there to actually forming a lasting connection with one person? How do people navigate that seemingly infinite pool of potential partners?
That's the perfect transition point. This is where we move from those initial attraction factors to theories that try to explain the actual process of relationship development.
Okay.
And a really classic theory here is Kirchhoff and Davis's filter theory, proposed way back in 1962.
Filter theory, like you're pouring all the possibilities through some kind of sieve.
That's a great way to think about it, yeah. The core concept is that we start with this very large group. They called it the field of availables, which is essentially everyone we could possibly meet or interact with.
Right, everyone out there.
And we gradually narrow down that pool through a series of filters.
Okay, let's walk through these filters then. What's the first one that comes into play according to their theory?
The first filter is social demography.
Okay.
This includes factors like geographical proximity, where you live or work, but also social class, ethnicity, religion, education level.
So the basics.
The fundamental assumption here is pretty simple. You're most likely to meet and form relationships with people who are geographically and socially close to you.
So people in your neighborhood, your school, your workplace, maybe social clubs, that sort of thing.
Right. Your initial field of availables is limited by who you actually come into contact with on a regular basis. It just requires less effort, less friction to start and maintain a relationship with someone who's physically and socially accessible.
Makes sense. You meet people who are available in the most practical sense. So what's the next filter after that?
The second filter they proposed is similarity in attitudes.
Okay, shared values.
Exactly. Shared values, beliefs, interests. Kirchhoff and Davis proposed this is particularly important in the early stages of a relationship. They actually suggested for relationships shorter than about 18 months.
Huh. Why is that key early on, do they think?
Well, because having similar attitudes just makes interaction easier, right? It facilitates self-disclosure.
Yeah.
You feel more comfortable sharing things with someone who sees the world in a similar way. It helps build that initial connection and bonding. As Byrne pointed out later, similarity is generally attractive, and dissimilarity can actively inhibit attraction, especially when you're just getting to know someone.
Got it. So you meet people nearby, and then among those, you connect best with those who think similarly to you, especially at the start. What's the third and final filter in this model?
The third filter is complementarity of needs.
Complementarity, so opposites attract now.
Sort of, but it's more nuanced.
Yeah.
This filter, they suggested, becomes more important in longer-term relationships. It's not just about being similar anymore, but about having differences that actually complement each other.
Like your strengths match their weaknesses, and maybe vice versa.
Exactly that. Or maybe one person is very decisive, and the other prefers to follow their lead. Kirchhoff and Davis specifically found this filter seemed more significant for couples who had been together for more than 18 months in their original study.
Hmm.
The idea is that these complementary traits can create a sense of balance, making the partnership feel kind of complete or mutually supportive.
So the filter theory paints this picture. You start with a vast crowd, filter it down by who's physically and socially near you, then filter again by who you share attitudes with, especially initially. And finally, for those relationships that last, you maybe find someone whose needs somehow complement your own.
That's the theoretical path, yeah. The theory lays out how we might move from that initial huge field of availables to a stable partnership.
Now, as anyone studying psychology knows, no theory is ever the final word. They get tested, evaluated, poked, and prodded over time. How has filter theory actually held up under scrutiny over the years?
Well, it definitely has some things going for it, but it also faces some pretty significant challenges, particularly as time and, well, technology change things.
Okay.
On the support side, it has good face validity.
Meaning it just feels right,
Yeah.
based on everyday experience.
Precisely. A lot of people describe their relationships starting in ways that seem to fit these filters. You hear it all the time. Oh, we met through work. That's social demography.
Right.
Or we bonded over our shared love of old movies. That's similarity. Or maybe he's the calm one, I'm the spontaneous one. We balance each other out. That sounds like complementarity.
Okay, so it resonates with people's stories. Is there any empirical evidence that actually backs up the stages?
There was some older work, like Winch's back in 1958, that seemed to align. He found that couples did seem to start with similar values, but that complementarity appeared to become more important later in marriage. So that fits somewhat with Kirchhoff and Davis's proposed timeline.
All right, so it has intuitive appeal, and some early research seemed to back parts of it up. But you mentioned challenges. Where does the theory start to wobble a bit, especially in the face of the modern world or newer research?
The challenges are pretty significant, yeah. One of the biggest is its temporal validity. Just think about that first filter. Social demography, based so heavily on physical proximity and your immediate social circles.
Right, who you physically bump into.
Exactly. But what has online dating done to that concept?
Oh yeah, completely changed it.
Technology has fundamentally altered the field of availables. You're no longer limited to finding partners in your town or your workplace or even your country. You can connect with people across the globe.
So that first filter, which used to be maybe the biggest constraint on who you could even consider, is essentially shattered or at least profoundly altered by the internet age.
Absolutely. It makes that initial filter much, much less rigid than it was when the theory was developed back in the 1960s.
Okay, that's a big one. What else?
Another issue that came up fairly early was replication. Levenger, in 1974, reviewed studies that tried to replicate Kirchhoff and Davis's original findings and noted that, well, many failed to reproduce the same clear results.
That's not good for a theory.
No. And Levenger also rightly criticized their rather arbitrary 18-month cutoff point between short-term and long-term relationships. He pointed out there's no inherent psychological reason why that specific duration should be the magic dividing line. It felt a bit artificial.
Okay, so the original findings weren't consistently found by others, and the proposed timeline feels a bit made up. What about the filters themselves? Are the roles of similarity and complementarity really as clear-cut as the theory suggests?
This is a major area of challenge now, particularly regarding cause versus effect with similarity.
How so?
Well, filter theory assumes similarity causes attraction and relationship progression. You find someone similar, then you get closer. But what if it works the other way around? What if being in a relationship actually makes you more similar over time?
Wait, you mean couples start to become alike because they're together? Not just that they got together because they were alike.
Exactly. Research increasingly suggests this happens. Anderson and colleagues in 2003 found evidence for something they called emotional convergence. Partners' emotional responses actually tend to become more similar over time the longer they're together.
Wow.
And Davis and Rusbolt in 2001 showed that people's attitudes actually shift and align to become more similar within an ongoing relationship.
That's a really powerful insight. It suggests similarity isn't just this fixed initial filter you pass through, it's a dynamic outcome of the relationship itself. You're not just attracted because you're similar, you might become more similar because you're together.
It adds this dynamic layer that a simple three-stage filter model really struggles to fully capture.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And following on from that, there's also questioning around the complementarity filter. Remember, the theory says this becomes key for long-term stability.
Yes, the idea of differences that complete you, basically.
Well, newer studies, like those by Anderson et al., again, and also Gruber-Baldini et al., in 1995, have actually found evidence that similarity continues to increase over time in relationships well into marriage.
So similarity keeps growing, not being replaced by complementarity.
It seems that way, yes.
Yeah.
This suggests that perhaps similarity remains really important throughout the relationship, maybe even increasingly so, and complementarity might not be as crucial for long-term success as Kirchhoff and Davis originally thought. Maybe it plays a role, but perhaps not the primary one in later stages.
So these criticisms really push our understanding forward, don't they? They show that relationships are much more dynamic, more fluid than a simple sequential filtering process suggests.
Definitely.
They evolve, people change within them, and big external factors like technology can completely reshape the landscape of how we meet and connect in the first place.
Yeah.
It really highlights why, in psychology, theories are constantly being tested, revised, and sometimes, well, maybe replaced or significantly updated.
Precisely. And for anyone studying psychonics, this is such a fundamental example of how the field progresses. You have a theory proposed, often a groundbreaking idea for its time, and then subsequent research builds on it, tests its assumptions, finds limitations, and leads us eventually to a more nuanced, albeit perhaps more complex, understanding.
Absolutely. It's about seeing the ongoing conversation within the research community over time. So this deep dive has really taken us on quite a journey today. We went from considering those potential universal factors in initial attraction and the powerful influence of the attractiveness stereotype, but then tempered that by looking at how individual differences affect who we find important.
Right.
Then we moved through a classic theory, filter theory, attempting to map the process of relationship formation with these sequential filters.
Yeah.
And finally, we spent time evaluating that theory, seeing its intuitive strength, but also where it's seriously challenged by technological change and newer findings about the dynamic nature of relationships.
A good summary of the path we took.
And the value here, especially if you're studying psychology, is seeing that whole process in action. How do theories evolve? How does new research from decades later force us to reconsider older, established ideas?
Exactly. Our understanding of complex human behavior like attraction and relationships isn't some finished book. It's really a constantly evolving manuscript.
Which brings us to maybe a final thought to leave you, the listener, with. Considering how profoundly online dating has, well, blown apart that initial field of availables filter, and given the compelling evidence that couples actually become more similar over time rather than just relying on complementarity, how might we need to update or even rethink something like filter theory for the 21st century?
Or, put another way, what entirely new psychological processes or maybe even new filters might be at play in the digital age that simply didn't exist or weren't relevant when Kirchhoff and Davis proposed their model way back in 1962.
Yeah, something to ponder as you think about relationships today.
Definitely food for thought.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the psychology of attraction and relationships.
Always a pleasure exploring these fascinating ideas with you.